Hello to you, whoever you are out there in the dark. My name is Vorin. I do not know if this recording will ever reach human ears, or if it will simply drift forever in the cold silence between stars. I have spent 30 years of my life sitting in a metal box, listening to the static of the galaxy, praying that the God Emperor would hear us. I was a fool. Today, he finally sent his angels, and I learned the terrible truth that we are not the people they came to save. We are just the mess they came to clean up. Before we step into the dark together, I ask you to stay with me until the end. The final moments of this story hold a truth that is heavy, yes, but necessary. It is a revelation about the price of silence and the weight of a human soul that I wish to share with you specifically. Please do not leave me to walk this path alone. The ending carries a quiet realization that I believe you will need to hear. Chapter 1. Signal from the Abyss. The floor was always cold. That is the first thing you learn about Station Ethelgard 9. It does not matter how hard the reactors push, or how many bodies are crammed into the sleeping quarters, the cold of the void always finds a way in. It seeps through the plasteel plating and settles in your bones. I was sitting at my station workstation 74, just as I had for the last 18 shifts. The air smelled of recycled sweat and ozone, a stale cocktail that coated the back of my throat. My hand moved automatically across the parchment. The auto quill fused to my index finger, scratched and scratched, a dry rhythmic sound that marked the passing of my life. Scritch, scratch. It was the only music we had. I was tired. It was a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep could no longer touch. My eyes burned from staring at the green lumens of the cogitator screen, watching streams of raw data scroll by like a waterfall of nonsense. I was a Vox scrivener. My job was not to understand the messages. My job was to transcribe the noise of the universe into neat, orderly rows of high Gothic script for the masters to ignore. I adjusted the headset, pressing the cups tighter against my ears. I wanted to block out the wheezing breath of the servitor bolted to the floor next to me. I just wanted to finish this shift. 20 hours. If I completed 20 hours without error, I would earn a Class A ration chit. Real meat. Not corpse starch or nutrient paste, but actual fibrous meat. I thought of my sister Ilara. I imagined the look on her face if I brought home real protein. That image was the only thing keeping my spine straight. Then the rhythm broke. It was subtle at first. The steady hum of background radiation usually sounded like rain falling on a tin roof, a comforting white noise that I had listened to for 3 decades. But this was different. It slid into the audio feed like a needle under a fingernail. It was not binary code. It was not the rhythmic pulsing of a ship drive or the chaotic static of a solar flare. It was wet. It sounded organic. I stopped writing. The auto quill hovered over the paper, dripping a single black tear of ink. I pressed the headset until it hurt my cartilage. I needed to be sure. The sound grew clearer. It was weeping. It was the sound of 1,000 voices crying out in unison, layered over each other, until they formed a single vibrating tone of misery. And beneath the crying, there was something else. A whisper. It scratched at the inside of my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. Open. That was the word. Or maybe it was broken. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that felt too loud in the sudden stillness of my mind. I looked around the processing floor. Rows of other scriveners were hunched over their desks, scribbling away oblivious. They did not have my ears. They did not have the curse of hearing the things that hide in the static. I reached for the Vox bead to alert the supervisor. Protocol demanded immediate reporting of any non-standard anomaly. My hand was shaking. I could feel the vibration of the crying voices traveling up my arm, making my nerves fire uncontrollably. I keyed the rune for the command deck. The line was dead. There was no static, no carrier wave, just a heavy, suffocating silence. That was when the lights changed. The harsh white lumens that illuminated the scribing hall flickered once, twice, and then died. Emergency lighting bathed the room in a bloody crimson wash. The sudden change in pressure made my ears pop. I knew that sensation. It meant the ventilation fans had just stopped. The hum of the life support systems, a sound so constant I had forgotten it existed, cut out completely. The silence that followed was heavy and physical. It pressed down on us like water deep in the ocean. The crying in my headset stopped, replaced by a single high-pitched tone that made my teeth ache. I looked at the main bulkhead door, the only exit from our sector. The locking mechanism spun with a heavy clank. The mag seals engaged with a thud that vibrated through the floor and up through the soles of my boots. We were not being invaded. We were being bottled. The supervisor's voice did not come over the Vox. There was no alarm siren, no instructions to evacuate, no calming lies about a drill. Just the red light and the silence. I looked at the man next to me, a scrivener named Jonas. He had stopped writing. He was staring at the blank screen of his cogitator, his mouth hanging slightly open. He looked at me, and in the red light, his eyes looked like dark, hollow pits. He asked me what was happening. I did not answer him. I could not tell him that the crying had stopped in the headset because it was now coming from the vents. The system had not failed. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had locked us in with the thing we were never meant to hear. It wasn't mercy. Chapter 2, The Silence Protocol. It had been an hour, maybe 2. Time becomes slippery when the air starts to run out. We were crowded into the connecting corridor of Zone C, 100 scriveners pressed shoulder to shoulder in the crimson dark. The air was already turning thick. It tasted sour, a mixture of unwashed bodies, stale recycled oxygen, and the sharp metallic tang of panic. You could taste the fear on your tongue. It coated the roof of my mouth like a film of grease. No one was screaming yet. That was the worst part. We were all Imperial servants trained from birth to await orders to stand still until told to move. So we stood. We stood in the red haze, sweating, breathing shallowly, waiting for a voice from above to tell us we weren't going to die here. But the silence from the comms was louder than any scream. The only sound was the collective wheezing of 100 pairs of lungs fighting for a thinning supply of oxygen. Then the Voxcasters crackled to life. The sound made half the crowd jump. It wasn't the supervisor. It was the automata. The machine spirit's recorded voice, flat and genderless. Attention. Biohazard containment active. Sector quarantined. Please remain at your stations. Compliance is mandatory. It repeated the message on a loop every 30 seconds, precise as a heartbeat. But on the 10th repetition, the message changed. It added a suffix I had never heard in 30 years of service. Authorization code, Inquisitorial Seal Vermilion. The words hung in the stale air. Most of the others didn't react. They just heard authorization and assumed help was coming. But I froze. I am a scrivener. I know codes. Vermilion isn't a rescue protocol. Vermilion is the color of absolute erasure. It means the data is too dangerous to exist. It means we are too dangerous to exist. Jonas was standing next to me. He had been trembling for the last hour, a low, constant vibration that I could feel through the sleeve of his robe. He suddenly stopped shaking. He looked at me, and his eyes were wide, too wide, the pupils dilated, until they were black pools, swallowing the red emergency light. "They are whispering," he said. His voice was calm, terrifyingly conversational. "The vents. Voren. They are whispering the names of my children. I tried to shush him to tell him it was just the air scrubbers failing, but he smiled. It was a broken, wet smile. He raised his hands to his face. His fingernails, long and yellow from years of quill work, dug into the soft skin beneath his eyes. He didn't scream. He just started to pull. He wanted to dig the sight of the world out of his head. I grabbed his wrists, wrestling him back, feeling his warm blood slick against my palms. The crowd recoiled, creating a small circle of emptiness around us. The struggle exhausted me faster than it should have. The CO2 was building up. My lungs burned, demanding air that wasn't there. The ventilation hadn't just failed. It had been reversed. They were sucking the oxygen out, preparing the environment for something else. Jonas went limp in my arms, weeping softly, blood streaming down his cheeks like tears of red oil. I leaned him against the bulkhead, my own head swimming. The Vox clicked one last time. The loop stopped. A new message replaced it louder, vibrating the deck plates beneath our feet. Astarte's fleet localized. Teleportarium solution calculated. Prepare for reception. A cheer went up from the crowd. The angel, someone shouted. They are here. They wept with joy. They hugged each other in the suffocating dark, thanking the God Emperor for his mercy. I looked at the blood on my hands. I looked at the sealed blast doors. They didn't understand. The angels don't teleport into a secure station to rescue clerks. They teleport in to kill things that walls cannot hold. Chapter 3. The uninvited guests. The cheering was unbearable. It was a desperate, wet sound, like animals baying at the moon before the slaughterhouse doors open. I couldn't stand it. While the others huddled near the main blast doors, waiting for the Emperor's chosen warriors to break the seal and lead us to safety, I slipped away. I needed to see. I crawled into a maintenance crawl space that ran parallel to the outer hull, a cramped tunnel full of pipes that burned my knees. At the end of it was a small inspection port, a circle of reinforced glass no bigger than a dinner plate. I wiped the condensation off with my sleeve and looked out into the void. I expected to see the golden prows of the Imperial Navy, or perhaps the crimson hulls of a local patrol fleet. I saw neither. Floating there against the backdrop of the uncaring stars was a ship unlike any I had ever studied in the recognition charts. It was a dagger of matte silver stripping away all ornamentation, all glory. It bore no Aquilas, no crusade banners, no lights to signal its presence. It drifted like a giant weaponized tombstone. It was beautiful in the way a scalpel is beautiful, pure purpose stripped of all humanity. It hung there in the silence of space, motionless, yet radiating a menace that made my stomach turn. There were no assault boats launching from its bays. There were no drop pods streaking down like comets. That was the first sign that we were wrong. You send drop pods when you want to capture ground. You send shuttles when you want to save people. This ship did not move. It simply waited. Then the lightning came. It didn't strike from the ship. It manifested directly upon our hull. Arcs of unnatural violet electricity lashed out from nowhere, tearing through the void shields of Station Ethelgard 9 as if they were made of paper. The entire station groaned. It was a deep metallic moan, the sound of the station's spine being twisted. I pressed my face against the cold glass, watching the impossible physics of teleportation flares blooming across the upper spires. They weren't docking. They were inserting directly into the command decks. The precision was surgical. They were bypassing the defenses, bypassing the airlocks, bypassing us. The smell hit me before the sound did. It drifted through the ventilation shafts, overpowering the stench of fear and sweat in the corridor behind me. It was the sharp metallic tang of ozone air that has been ionized by massive energy discharges. It tasted like sucking on a battery. And then riding on that draft of electrified air came the sound. It started as a thud, then a crash, And then, screaming. It wasn't the screaming of panic anymore. It was the screaming of people being hunted. It filtered down from the upper levels, distorted by the metal pipes, echoing like ghosts in the walls. The cheering in the corridor behind me faltered. The prayers died in their throats. We looked up at the ceiling, listening to the heavy, rhythmic thud of armored boots walking on the deck above us. They were not coming to open the doors. They were working their way down. Chapter 4. The Infection. The corridor wasn't just cold anymore. It was wrong. The geometry of the room felt slippery, as if the walls were breathing in time with my own panic. Jonas, the man I had dragged away from the wall moments ago, was writhing on the floor. He wasn't crying anymore. He was making a sound like wet leather stretching until it tears. I knelt beside him thinking he was having a seizure from the oxygen deprivation. I was wrong. His skin was rippling, not shivering. Rippling like something was moving underneath the dermis, blindly looking for a way out. Symbols burning with an inner witchlight began to carve themselves into his flesh. They weren't tattoos. They were wounds opening up in patterns that made my eyes bleed just looking at them. The air around him grew hot, smelling of sulfur and old blood. "Jonas," I whispered. He turned his head. His eyes were gone. In their place were two burning coals of malice. He opened his mouth, and his jaw unhinged with a sickening pop. He lunged. The speed was impossible for a malnourished scrivener. He pinned me to the deck plates, his fingers now elongated into bone-white talons, digging into my shoulders. His breath washed over me, rotting and hot. And then he spoke. But the voice wasn't his. It was high, sweet, and innocent. "Did you get the meat, Vorin? Did you bring me the good food?" It was Alara. It was my little sister's voice bubbling up from that monster's throat, twisted into a gurgling mockery of love. That sound broke me. It shattered the paralysis of fear and replaced it with cold, jagged survival instinct. My hand found the auto quill still clipped to my belt. It was a cheap instrument, metal and plastic, designed for writing inventory lists, not taking lives. I drove it into his neck. I didn't think about it. I just pushed until I felt the metal scrape against the vertebrae. The sound of his neck snapping was loud, louder than the shouting around us. It was a dry, brittle snap, like stepping on a dead branch in winter. Jonas went limp, his heavy body collapsing on top of me. The witch light in his skin faded instantly, leaving only a bruised, ruined corpse. I shoved him off, gasping for air that tasted like copper. I looked at the auto quill in my hand, coated in black ichor. I had just killed a man I had shared lunch with for 5 years. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel sadness. I just felt a cold, gray numbness spreading through my chest. The chaos in the room suddenly quieted, but not because of what I had done. All eyes turned to the main blast door. The center of the thick plasteel was glowing cherry red. It bubbled and hissed, the metal running like wax. Something was burning its way in. Chapter 5. The Silver Shadows. The blast door didn't explode inward. It didn't fly off its hinges. It simply dissolved. The center of the metal slumped into a puddle of glowing slag, creating an opening that breathed black smoke into our sanctuary. The heat was instantaneous, searing the air from our lungs. Through the haze, silhouettes appeared. They were massive, far too large to be human. They blocked out the emergency lights, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched across the panicked crowd. The scriveners, my colleagues, the people I had shared rations and complaints with for decades, did not cower. They surged forward. In their desperation, they saw the shape of Astartes' armor, and their minds filled in the rest. They saw salvation. They saw the Emperor's angels coming to lift them from this hell. They ran towards the smoke, with arms outstretched, weeping tears of joy. "Praise be a woman," screamed her voice, cracking with hysteria. "They have come. The Emperor protects. The first figure stepped through the breach. The floor plates groaned under the weight. It was a giant clad in Terminator plate, a walking tank of ceramite and plasteel. The armor was unpainted raw silver that caught the red emergency lights and twisted them into bloody reflections. He wore no helmet, or perhaps he did, and the design was so alien I couldn't recognize it. Embedded in the chest plate was an open book carved from steel, and words of warding were etched into every inch of the silver surface. He didn't look at the crowd rushing towards him. He didn't raise a hand in greeting. He didn't acknowledge their prayers. He simply raised his right arm. The twin barrels of a storm bolter, boxy and brutal, leveled at the chest of the woman who had screamed. There was no warning, no order to halt, no demand for identification. The storm bolter roared. It wasn't the sharp crack of a laser gun or the rattle of a stubber. It was a deep percussive thud that you felt in your diaphragm more than you heard with your ears. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was rhythmic, mechanical, and utterly indifferent. The woman didn't fall. She disintegrated. The mass-reactive rounds hit her and detonated inside her ribcage, turning a living, breathing human being into a wet, red mist in the span of a heartbeat. The giant didn't stop. He swept the weapon across the crowd in a slow, calculated arc. The line of fire was a scythe. Men and women were cut apart, their bodies exploding into fragments of bone and uniform. The cheering died, instantly replaced by a silence that was shattered only by the relentless pounding of the bolters. I didn't run towards them. Some instinct, some deep primal cowardice that had kept my ancestors alive in the gutters of hive cities, seized control of my legs. I threw myself backward. I scrambled over desks and dead terminals, sliding into a narrow maintenance alcove, half hidden by a bundle of cooling pipes. I pulled my knees to my chest and pressed my hands over my ears, but I couldn't block it out. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of meat being processed. Thump, thump, thump. It went on and on. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the afterimage of the silver giants was burned into my retinas. They moved with a terrified efficiency. They weren't fighting a battle. They were sterilizing a wound, and we were the infection. The firing stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was worse. It was wet. The air was thick with a fine red mist that tasted of copper and iron. I dared to crack one eye open. The corridor was a slaughterhouse. The floor was slick with blood covering the boots of the Grey Knights as they advanced. They didn't check for survivors. They didn't check for pulses. They simply walked over the carpet of bodies, their heavy boots crushing bone and glass alike. They were heading deeper into the station. They hadn't come to save us from the monsters. To them, there was no difference between the possessed man and the terrified clerk. We were all just biomass that had been exposed. We were all just loose ends. I stayed in the dark. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. It wasn't a rescue. It was an erasure. Chapter 6. The Survivor's Choice. I ran until the taste of blood was the only thing I knew. My boots slammed against the grating of the technical corridors, a frantic, clattering rhythm that echoed too loudly in the confined space. I wasn't alone in the tunnels. Behind me, down the long, throat-like passage of Sector 4, I could hear them coming. Not the silver giants. Not this time. These were the other things, the spilled guts of the warp that had leaked out of Jonas and the others. I could hear the wet slap, slap, slap of shapeless feet hitting the metal and the high-pitched giggling of creatures that found joy in tearing tendons from bone. A group of maintenance workers from the heat exchange unit were running ahead of the creatures sprinting towards the intersection where I stood. I knew them. I knew the man in the lead, a grayer-haired tech named Harlan. He had given me extra rec time last week. He saw me standing by the heavy bulkhead door, and relief washed over his terrified face. "Vorin," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Hold the door. For the Emperor's sake. Hold the door." I reached for the control panel. My hand hovered over the locking rune. But then I looked down the adjacent hallway, the one that led to the safe zone. At the far end, partially obscured by steam venting from a broken pipe, I saw the shimmer of silver armor. A gray knight was walking towards the intersection. He was methodical, scanning every alcove with his stormbolter raised. If he saw the refugees, he would see the creatures chasing them. He would see the corruption spilling out of Sector 4, and he would do what he was bred to do. He would purge the entire intersection. He would burn the creatures, the workers, and me. He wouldn't sort the clean from the unclean. To him, we were all just a blast radius. Time seemed to slow down into a thick, syrupy sludge. I looked at Harlan running towards me. I looked at the monsters skittering in the shadows behind him, their small, razor-filled mouths open in anticipation. And I looked at the heavy blast door that separated Sector 4 from the hallway where I stood. If I left it open, we all died. If I closed it, the knight would see a sealed bulkhead. He would read the biohazard rune. He would assume the sector was already contained and move on to the next target. I would be just another piece of scenery on the clean side of the wall. Harlan was 10 meters away. He was reaching out his hand. I hit the rune. The door didn't close slowly. It slammed shut with a hiss of hydraulics that sounded like a guillotine blade dropping. Harlan didn't stop in time. He slammed into the thick plasteel with a heavy thud that I felt through the soles of my boots. Through the small, reinforced viewing port, I saw his face pressed against the glass. He wasn't screaming at the monsters anymore. He was screaming at me. He was mouthing my name over and over, his eyes, wide with a betrayal so deep it looked like madness. Then the shadows behind him caught up. I saw a spray of red hit the glass from the inside. I saw Harlan gets pulled backward into the dark. I didn't look away. I couldn't. I stood there, my hand still resting on the cold metal of the door controls. On the other side of the wall, the screaming rose to a fever pitch, and then mercifully turned into wet, gurgling sounds. Then, silence. I turned my back to the door just as the Grey Knight emerged from the steam. He stopped 5 feet from me. He towered over me, a statue of judgment. The lenses of his helmet glowed a piercing blue. He looked at me shivering against the wall. Then, he looked at the sealed door. He raised a scanning device on his gauntlet. It beeped once. Contained. He lowered his weapon and walked past me, his heavy footsteps fading down the corridor. I slid down the wall until I hit the floor. I thought of Ilara. I asked myself if it had been her face pressed against the glass, begging me to open the door. Would I have done it? Would I have locked my own sister in the dark to save my skin? I sat there in the silence, listening to the hum of the station, and I realized the answer was yes. The war for the soul is a lie. When the end comes, there is only the war for the breath in your lungs. I was alive. That was my sin, and I would keep committing it. Chapter 7. The Silence of the Mind. I found shelter in the main server farm of the Cogitation Spire. It was a forest of black monoliths, rows of towering machines that hummed with a deep, vibrating bass. The air here was freezing, kept at sub-zero temperatures to keep the logic engines from melting, but I didn't feel the cold. I was numb. I wedged myself into the narrow gap between a high-voltage magnetic coil and the rear casing of a data stack. The electromagnetic field from the coil made the hair on my arms stand up and filled my mouth with the taste of tin, but I knew, or I prayed, that the interference would hide me. Then the heavy doors hissed open. He walked in alone. This one was different. His armor was more ornate, draped in a tabard of cream-colored cloth that was stained with soot. A Justicar. He didn't raise his Stormbolter. He didn't scan the room with the optic sensors on his helmet. He simply stood in the center of the aisle and tilted his head like a man listening to a distant melody. The air pressure in the room dropped instantly. My nose began to bleed. It wasn't a physical blow. It was a hammer striking the inside of my skull. He wasn't looking for heat signatures or motion. He was hunting for minds. He was tasting the air for the flavor of fear. For a second, the shield of the magnetic coil faltered, or perhaps his power was just that strong. A connection snapped into place. It wasn't him reading me. It was a backwash, a leak in his mental shielding. I saw a flash of white. I felt a pain that was not mine. I saw a child, a boy no older than 10, being dragged across a floor of obsidian. I saw a knife. I felt the cold, clinical removal of humanity piece by piece, to be replaced by silver and hatred. It was a lifetime of torture condensed into a millisecond. I almost screamed. I realized then that underneath that armor there wasn't a man. There was just a boy who had been murdered a long time ago, and a weapon built from his bones. He turned his head sharply to the left, away from me. There were others hiding 3 rows down. I hadn't known they were there. I couldn't see them, but I heard them gasp as the Justicar focused his attention. He didn't fire a shot. He didn't speak a word of judgment. He simply clenched his fist. There was a wet, muffled sound like a melon being crushed under a heavy blanket. The gasps stopped instantly. The presence withdrew from my mind, leaving me trembling and sick. The Justicar turned and walked out, his cape swirling in the freezing air. He had purged the unclean thoughts. I stayed behind the coil for a long time. The only sound was the humming of the machines. I could smell something burning faint and sweet. It wasn't the smell of promethium or ozone. It was the smell of cooked meat and singed hair. I wiped the blood from my upper lip and swallowed the bile rising in my throat. He hadn't used a bullet. He had just thought them to death. Chapter 8. The demon in the machine. I couldn't stay on the main levels. The slaughter was moving too fast, sweeping through the corridors like a fire in a dry forest. I forced open the maintenance hatch to the central elevator shaft, a vertical throat of darkness that ran the length of the station. I grabbed the service ladder, the rungs cold and slick with grease, and began to climb. Above me, the darkness was alive. Usually, the shaft was filled with the rhythmic clanking of the counterweights and the hum of the magnetic drives. Now it was filled with screaming. Not human screaming, electronic screaming. The Vox grills built into the walls were shrieking in binary, a chaotic, garbled language that sounded like a modem choking on blood. The machine spirits weren't just malfunctioning, they were in agony. The corruption had seeped into the station's nervous system. I looked up. 50 meters above me, the main cargo elevator was descending, but it wasn't moving right. It wasn't sliding on its rails, it was crawling. The metal box had warped. The plasteel walls were bulging and pulsing like infected skin. The heavy suspension cables that held it were no longer steel ropes. They were thick, twisting veins of gray flesh, dripping black oil onto my face. The elevator car itself had grown teeth-jagged shards of torn metal that gnashed together as it hunted. It wasn't a machine anymore. It was a predator, and I was the insect trapped in its throat. It screeched a sound of grinding gears and wet meat and plummeted toward me, defying the safety brakes. I froze. There was nowhere to go. The ladder was bolted to the wall. I pressed myself against the rungs, closing my eyes, waiting to be crushed by the weight of the possessed metal. Then, the world turned white. A lance of energy brighter than a star pierced the shaft wall from the corridor outside. It was a nemesis force halberd, thrown or thrust with the force of a thunderbolt. The blade punched through the reinforced concrete, through the steel plating, and drove straight into the underbelly of the demon elevator. The energy discharged instantly. Blue lightning exploded inside the shaft, frying the biological corruption in a split second. The elevator shrieked one last time, a human dying sound, and disintegrated into a shower of molten slag and ash. But the strike was too powerful. The lightning arc severed the service ladder I was clinging to. I didn't have time to scream. The metal rungs twisted and snapped. I fell. It was a short drop, maybe only 2 floors, but I hit the maintenance platform below with the grace of a sack of wet cement. I heard the crack before I felt the pain. My right leg, the tibia, snapped cleanly in 2. I lay there in the dark, covered in the ash of the dead machine, gasping for air. Above me, through the hole the weapon had made, I saw a silver gauntlet retrieve the halberd. The Grey Knight didn't look down. He didn't care that he had saved me, and he didn't care that he had broken me. He had simply neutralized the threat. I was just debris in the wake of his holy war. The metal groaned beneath me. I dragged myself into the corner, the pain in my leg singing a song of white-hot agony. I was broken, but I was still breathing. Chapter 9 Eye Contact. I dragged my broken leg behind me like a sack of wet grain. The pain was a living thing, a white-hot wire tightening around my shin with every inch I crawled. I had reached the end of the line, a dead-end service junction with a locked door that wouldn't budge. I turned around, putting my back against the cold steel, and waited. There was nowhere left to run. The heavy rhythmic thud of footsteps stopped. He filled the corridor. A single Grey Knight blocked the only exit. His silver armor was blackened by soot and deeply scored by claws, but he stood unyielding, a mountain of ceramite and violence squeezed into a human-shaped hallway. His helmet was gone. Maybe it had been torn off in the fighting, or maybe he had discarded it to better sense the corruption. It was the first time I had seen one of them flesh to flesh. I wished I hadn't. His face was a landscape of scars, pale as a corpse that had been drained of all blood. There was no softness in it, no trace of mercy, doubt, or humanity. But it was the eyes that froze the marrow in my bones. They didn't have whites. They didn't have pupils. They were solid orbs of glowing blue light burning with a psychic intensity that made the air around him shimmer. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a ghost haunting a suit of armor. He looked at me. For a terrifying second, those burning eyes locked onto mine. I expected to see judgment. I expected to see hatred for the weakness I represented. But there was nothing. It was worse than hatred. It was total indifference. To him, I was just a variable in an equation that needed to be balanced to 0. Entity human. Status potentially compromised. Solution termination. He raised the storm bolter. The twin barrels looked like tunnels into the abyss. I didn't beg. I didn't scream. I didn't have the breath left. I just closed my eyes. I tried to summon the image of Alara's face to hold on to one pure thing before the dark took me. I'm sorry, I thought. I tried. The trigger didn't click. The floor beneath us buckled. A concussive wave from the station's main reactor, critical and failing miles below us, slammed into the sector with the force of a god's hammer. The explosion blew out the structural wall to my right, instantly venting the corridor into the vacuum of the adjacent hangar bay. I was thrown sideways, tumbling through debris and smoke like a rag doll. The sudden violence saved me. The blast knocked the aim of the Astartes just wide, and the depressurization sucked me away from his executioner's gaze. The last thing I saw before the smoke swallowed me was the Grey Knight standing immovable in the hurricane of fire, his glowing eyes still fixed on the spot where I had been. It wasn't a miracle, it was just gravity and luck. But in this universe, that is the closest thing to divine intervention you will ever get. Chapter 10. The Dance of Death. I didn't hit the ground. There was no ground left. The reactor blast had torn a jagged wound in the side of the station, venting the atmosphere and gravity into the void. I was floating. The pain in my broken leg was a dull, distant throb, now muffled by the absolute silence of the vacuum. That is the thing about space. It is peaceful. Without air to carry sound, the war becomes a silent film. I drifted through a cloud of debris, shattered glass, twisted metal, and frozen spheres of red blood that looked like rubies suspended in the dark. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I spun slowly weightless, watching the stars wheel overhead through the tear in the roof. For a moment, I forgot the monsters. I forgot the executioners. I was just a speck of dust dancing in the infinite. Then the other dancers joined me. They poured through the breach in the hull creatures of pale lilac flesh and impossible multi-jointed limbs. The Neverborn. In gravity, they are fast. In zero gravity, they are fluid. They moved like eels through water, propelling themselves off floating wreckage with a terrifying, sensuous grace. They didn't scream, or if they did, the vacuum swallowed it. They just smiled, mouths full of needles reaching for me, with claws that promised 1,000 years of pain. But before they could touch me, the silver shapes intercepted them. The Grey Knights didn't struggle in the void. Their magnetic boots locked onto drifting hull plates, turning floating debris into platforms for war. It wasn't a fight. It was a ballet of slaughter. I watched, mesmerized, as a knight spun his nemesis force halberd. The blade crackled with psychic frost, cutting not just flesh, but the fabric of reality itself. He moved with a speed that the human eye shouldn't be able to track yet. In the slow motion of 0G, I saw every detail. A demon lunged. The halberd flashed. The demon came apart in 3 clean sections. No blood spray, just ichor freezing instantly into purple crystals. It was perfect. It was mathematical. There was no anger in their movements, only an absolute cold precision. I watched them dismantle the nightmares of the warp with the same detached efficiency a gardener weeds a flower bed. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of dying anymore. I was just awestruck. I saw the terrible symmetry of the universe, the monsters that want to eat our souls, and the monsters we built to eat them back. I was nothing. I was a gnat, watching gods wrestle in the heavens. The last demon shattered into dust, its essence banished back to the hell it came from. The knights didn't look for survivors. They turned their backs on me, their boots magnetically clamping to the outer hull as they marched silently toward the next breach. The silence returned heavier than before. Chapter 11. A Meaningless Prayer. I limped into the chapel of the saints' tears. It was the only place left with atmosphere, the emergency shutters having sealed it off from the vacuum outside. It was crowded. Dozens of station clergy scribes and lay priests were huddled around the central altar, their robes tangled together in a mass of trembling cloth. The air was thick with the smoke of sacred incense, so heavy it burned my eyes. They were chanting. It was a low, desperate drone, a wall of sound built from the litany of protection. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. They said it like a spell. They believed that if they said it loud enough, if they believed it hard enough, the golden light of Terra would descend and shield them from the darkness. I stood by the door, dripping blood onto the mosaic floor, and I felt a terrible pity. They thought the monsters were the only thing they had to fear. They didn't know who had come to save them. The heavy oak doors of the chapel didn't open. They disintegrated. A squad of Grey Knights interceptors, equipped with personal teleporters, materialized in the nave. They didn't walk. They flickered into existence, displacing the air with a thunderclap that shattered the stained glass windows. The chanting faltered, then swelled. The priests raised their hands, thinking their prayers had been answered. The High Confessor stepped forward, a golden aquila clutched in his hands, tears streaming down his face. "My lords," he cried, his voice breaking with relief. "We are faithful. We have held the light. We are." The lead knight didn't let him finish. He raised a heavy weapon, an incinerator fueled by psychically charged promethium. He pulled the trigger. It wasn't normal fire. It was a torrent of blue-white liquid flame that moved with a mind of its own. It washed over the High Confessor and the front rows of the congregation. It didn't just burn flesh, it burned the soul. The screaming was instantaneous and absolute. I watched as men and women people who had spent their entire lives in service to the throne were turned to ash in seconds. The flame didn't care about their piety. It didn't care about their years of service. To the Grey Knights, these people weren't faithful servants. They were potential carriers. They were witnesses who had seen things mortals were not meant to see. Their faith was not a shield. It was a liability. I backed away into the shadows of the vestibule, the heat of the blue fire singing my eyebrows. The chanting had stopped. There was only the roar of the incinerator and the crackling of bone. I watched the knight sweep the nozzle back and forth, methodical, thorough. He was sanitizing the room. I realized then the true horror of our existence. We are told the Emperor loves us. We are told our faith saves us. But in the face of the true enemy, our faith is just noise. The incense couldn't hide the smell. The smell of roast meat overpowered the holy smoke. Chapter 12. The only communication. I made it to the command spire. The journey was a blur of pain and adrenaline dragging my broken leg past bodies that looked like discarded dolls. The main control deck was a tomb. The officers were slumped over their consoles, having executed the final standing order of suicide, rather than face the entities from the warp. I didn't look at them. I pulled myself up to the Vox Master's terminal. The main lights were dead, but the emergency power still hummed in the copper wiring beneath the desk. I had one goal left. I knew I was dead. I knew there was no escape pod waiting for me. But I needed Alara to know. I needed to send one message, just a few words, to tell her to take the ration chits hidden under the floorboards and run. Run to the Underhive, run to the dark, anywhere but here. My fingers, broken and bloody, danced over the rune keys. Recipient Ilara Varin Hive, Primus Hab Block 7. Message: I'm sorry. Take the box. Go. I hit the transmit rune. The progress bar began to fill on the cracked screen. 20%, 40%. It was the slowest thing I had ever watched. I stared at the green light, praying to a god I no longer believed in. Just let it go. Just let her hear me one last time. Then the screen flickered. The progress bar froze at 98%. A heavy metallic thud shook the floor behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew what it was. I could hear the whirring of servos and the clicking of mechanical limbs. A mechadendrite, a serpentine metal tentacle tipped with a data spike, snaked past my shoulder. It plunged into the console, shattering the glass screen. The sparks showered my face, stinging my skin, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't. I looked up. A Grey Knight tech marine stood over me. He was terrifying, more machine than man, his armor fused with strange, esoteric equipment that hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. On his back, a servo arm twitched restlessly. He looked at the message frozen on the broken screen. He didn't read it with eyes. He read the data directly through the spike. He looked at me, his voice a grinder of gravel and static. Sentiment is a vulnerability, he said. To know is to be corrupted. To speak is to spread the plague. I tried to speak. I wanted to beg him. She doesn't know anything, I croaked, tears cutting tracks through the soot on my face. It's just goodbye. Please. The tech marine didn't care. With a casual flick of his mechadendrite, he ripped the Voxcaster's core out of the console. The machine died with a high-pitched whine. The message was gone, deleted, erased, before it ever touched the void. "Understanding is a disease," he stated flatly, turning away to purge the station's data banks. "I am the cure." I sat there in the dark staring at the ruined machine. That was the cruelest cut of all. He didn't just kill me. He erased the proof that I had ever loved anyone. He made my silence absolute. It was worse than dying. It was being unmade. Chapter 13. Sanitization. I dragged myself to Hangar Bay 4. It was the only launch deck still intact, the others having been vented into the void or slagged by plasma fire during the initial breach. Through the cracked blast glass of the observation deck, I saw a small Arvis lighter, a squat, ugly cargo hauler sitting on the landing pad. Its engines were idling, coughing out plumes of black exhaust that swirled in the thin atmosphere. It was the ugliest thing I had ever seen, and it was the most beautiful. It was a hearse, but it was leaving. I tried to stand up to run, but my leg was useless dead weight. I clawed my way across the floor, leaving a trail of smeary blood on the pristine white tiles. I had to get there. I had to get inside before the pilot realized the station was dead. Then I saw them. A squad of gray knights was clustered around the main structural pillars of the hangar. They weren't fighting. They were working. They were clamping large cylindrical devices to the load-bearing beams with terrifying efficiency. The devices hummed with a deep, sickening thrum that I could feel vibrating in my teeth. I recognized the markings from the forbidden manuals I wasn't supposed to read. Cyclonic charges. Not the planet killers used for full exterminatus, but tactical warheads designed to vaporize a city block or a space station. I remembered an old joke from the engineering bay, how Harlan used to laugh and say, "One day they'll exterminatus this place just to save on the heating bill." It wasn't funny anymore. The joke had become the terminal reality. They weren't just killing the witnesses, they were erasing the crime scene. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. While the knights were distracted by the consecration of their bombs, chanting final rites over the detonators, I slithered up the open loading ramp of the Arvis. The cargo hold was dark, smelling of hydraulic fluid and cold metal. I wedged myself behind a crate of rations, pulling a greasy tarp over my shivering body. Moments later, the engines roared to life. The ship lurched, defying gravity with a groan of stressed metal. We lifted off. Through a gap in the cargo bay doors, I watched Ethelgard 9 recede. It was a small, fragile thing against the black. Then the charges detonated. Didn't explode like in the holovids. It imploded. A sphere of absolute white light swallowed the station, collapsing it into a momentary star before vanishing into nothingness. There was no debris field. There was no wreckage to scavenge. Just empty space where my life used to be. The vibration of the ship's deck rattled my bones, shaking me apart. But the silence inside my head was absolute. I had escaped the fire, but I knew with a heavy, sinking certainty that I had not escaped the consequences. We were not flying toward freedom. Chapter 14. The Black Ship. I lay in the dark for hours, or maybe days. The cargo hold was a freezing metal box, vibrating with the sub-light growl of the engines. My only companion was a deactivated servitor, its lobotomized face frozen in a permanent slack-jawed stare. I huddled under the greasy tarp, clutching my broken leg, listening to the silence of the ship. I tried to tell myself I was lucky. I tried to tell myself that I had cheated the Emperor's executioners. But deep down in the pit of my stomach, the dread was heavier than the gravity plating. A civilian hauler doesn't fly this smooth. A smuggler's ship doesn't move with this kind of disciplined precision. We weren't running. We were being delivered. The engines cut out. The vibration replaced by the distinct heavy clank of docking clamps locking onto the hull. I dragged myself toward the rear of the bay, finding a hairline fracture in the outer plating, where the welding had stressed. I put my eye to the crack. I expected to see the brown smog of a hive world or the comforting neon of a trade station. I saw neither. Floating in the void, eclipsing the stars, was a fortress of black iron. It was a ship the size of a city covered in Gothic spires and gargoyles that seemed to scream into the vacuum. On its flank, illuminated by harsh floodlights, was a symbol that every citizen of the Imperium is taught to fear. More than death itself, the crimson rosette of the Holy Inquisition emblazoned with the skull. We were parked in the shadow of Titan. I hadn't escaped. I had just changed jailers. The cargo ramp didn't lower slowly. It hissed open with a hydraulic snap, flooding the dark hold with blinding white light. I squinted, shielding my eyes with a trembling hand. Silhouettes marched up the ramp. They weren't the disorganized militia of a planetary defense force. They were stormtroopers, elite scions, clad in heavy carapace armor, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks that gave them the appearance of skull-faced insects. They moved in perfect unison, their hellguns raised and active. The laser sights cut through the gloom of the cargo hold a dozen red dots, dancing across the crates, the floor, and finally settling on my chest. I didn't run. I didn't reach for a weapon. I knew better. I simply pushed the tarp aside and raised my hands. I looked at the red dots clustered over my heart, pulsing like tiny, angry stars. A man in a long coat flanked by the soldiers stepped forward. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. He checked a slate in his hand, then looked at me. "Subject secure," he said into his Vox speed. "Prepare for processing." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. They weren't going to kill me. Not yet. The Grey Knights kill you to keep the secret. The Inquisition keeps you to extract it. I realized then that I had made a terrible mistake. Death on Ethelgard 9 would have been a mercy. I had jumped out of the frying pan and straight into the furnace. The soldier stepped closer, and I saw the reflection of my own terrified face in the red lenses of his helmet. "Welcome to the Ordo Malleus," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a sentence. Chapter 15. The Interrogation. The cell was white. Not the soft white of clouds, but the blinding, sterile white of a dead eyeball. There were no shadows here, nowhere to hide. I was strapped to a chair made of cold surgical steel. My broken leg had been fixed, or at least the bone had been fused back together with a brutal efficiency that left a thick ridge of scar tissue under my skin. I sat there naked and shivering, waiting for the torture to begin. But there were no hot pokers. There were no racks. Just a man sitting across from me behind a desk of polished obsidian. He was old, his skin like parchment stretched over a skull, wearing the simple robes of a scribe. But the rosette on his chest was made of gold and rubies. An inquisitor. He didn't look at me with hate. He looked at me with the detached curiosity of a biologist dissecting a frog. "You saw the Neverborn," he said softly. It wasn't a question. "You saw the silver ghosts. Most minds shatter. Yours did not." He tapped a slate on his desk. A grainy holographic projection flickered into life between us. It was the security feed from the intersection in Sector 4. I watched myself pixelated and ghostly standing by the bulkhead door. I watched Harlan running towards me. I watched myself hit the lock rune. I watched Harlan die against the glass. The shame washed over me, hot and suffocating. I tried to look away, but my head was clamped in place. "Why?" the Inquisitor asked. "Why did you lock it? They were your friends." "I wanted to live," I whispered. My voice was a dry croak. I knew if the Knight saw the corruption, he would burn us all. I had to make the sector look clean. I had to hide the stain. I waited for the bolt pistol. I waited for him to call me a coward and execute me for my betrayal. But he didn't. A slow, dry smile spread across his withered face. "Precisely," he said. "You didn't act out of panic. You acted out of calculation. You sacrificed the few to preserve the illusion of order. You understood the necessity of the purge. He stood up and walked around the desk, his hand resting on my shoulder. It felt like a claw. Most men try to be heroes. Heroes are liabilities. They try to save everyone and save no one. You are a survivor. You possess the coldness we require. I signed the death warrant for Ethelgard 9, he whispered into my ear. I sent the Grey Knights. And out of 10,000 souls, you are the only variable that surprises me. He gestured to the Medici servitor hovering in the corner. It drifted forward, a high-pitched drill, spinning at the end of a multi-jointed arm. The sound was a mosquito whine that drilled into my teeth, a sound I knew would be the last thing I heard. As Vorin. We have a use for men who can close the door on their own humanity, he said. But first, we must ensure you never open it again. A mind is a fortress, and I am locking the gate. The drill descended toward my temple. I didn't scream. I just closed my eyes and waited for the white to turn to black. Chapter 16. The End of Vorin. I woke up standing. My body was locked into a harness in a room filled with steam and the scent of abrasive cleaners. My head felt strange, light, airy, as if a heavy stone had been removed from inside my skull. I tried to bring up the image of Ilara. I knew the name. I knew she was my sister. I knew I had loved her. But when I reached for the memory, there was no emotion attached to it. It was like looking at a data file for a stranger. Subject Ilara. Status deceased. Relevance null. The grief that had defined my life, the driving force that had made me steal and lie and survive was gone. It had been drilled out of me, replaced by a cold, white static. I didn't feel sad about this loss. I didn't feel anything at all. I raised a hand to touch my face. My fingers didn't find skin. They met cold, riveted iron. My face was gone, encased in a rebreather mask, permanently fused to my jawbone. I breathed in, and the mask rattled with a wet hiss. Rattle hiss. It was the sound of my new life. A servant approached me. He held a gray robe and a heavy laser gun. He didn't ask my name. He didn't look me in the eye. He simply handed me a slate with my new orders. Acolyte 734, he said. Transport leaves in T-minus 10 minutes. Target orbital relay, Beta Sigma. Signal anomaly detected. I took the gun. The weight of it felt good in my hands. It felt right. I was no longer Varen the Scrivener. Varen had died in the ruins of Ethelgard 9, burned away by the revelation of the Grey Knights. What remained was something purer. I was a tool. I was a weapon to be pointed at the dark. I checked the power pack of the laser gun, humming a tune I couldn't quite remember the words to. The fear was gone. The hope was gone. There was only the duty and the silence. I walked toward the transport bay. The war would continue. It always did. Thank you for listening to my confession. It is a rare thing in this grim darkness to be heard without judgment. I hope my story serves as a warning, or perhaps a lesson, on the true cost of survival. If you have the courage to hear more whispers from the void, if you wish to stand with me as we uncover the truths the Inquisition tries to bury, then subscribe to this channel. Leave a like to prove that you are still here, and that the silence has not yet taken you. Do it now, before the next signal begins.